Hi everyone, welcome to a series of webinars for updating firmware. My name is Lachlan and we're currently at CameraPro Brisbane. I hope we're doing all well this morning. So just a bit of, housekeeping. So we'll be here updating firmware for Canon cameras this morning, and we'll take the first 30 minutes to go through that and just run through quickly how to get it done. And then the last 30 minutes we'll run a bit of extra question time. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation today, I do have my moderators over here with me in the room, so they can answer those questions or direct them to me. And yeah, so feel free anytime if you want to answer any questions, ask any questions, just let us know. We'll be able to help you out. All right, well, let's get stuck right into it. So as I mentioned just a second ago, this morning will be all Canon cameras. Canon's really good in that a lot of their cameras tend to be quite similar in terms of their menu function. So this will be quite easy to apply to whatever camera you have. But at the moment, we're going to be doing an update on the EOS R. We'll be doing a range of brands on firmware updating, not just today with Fuji later on, but also tomorrow and next Tuesday with the rest of the brands that we have set up. So I guess we'll start out with a preface, is why update your firmware? So I guess as an idea, there's an ongoing push towards support for products, particularly in cameras, so that the manufacturers will continue to support them after they've been released with feature updates, bug fixes, compatibility updates, and things like that. So it's a good idea to keep your camera firmware up to date, just so you get the most benefit out of your camera. That includes most things like, let's say, autofocus improvements. You see a lot of those, and compatibility things with new lenses that are coming out, that sort of thing. So it's good to keep them updated. Now, for generally the most part, you must understand that a firmware update is a change to the camera's software, effectively. So it's usually non-reversible, something to think about before you go ahead. And also, because you are changing a fundamental aspect of the camera, you have a chance, if things don't go quite as smoothly, to brick your camera. So just to make you fully aware, very transparent, that you need to know these things before you go ahead and be prepared so that it all goes smoothly. And that's what we're here today. So to get started, most brands will require a freshly formatted card. You should format the card in camera. That will provide the least risk when it comes to updating firmware. You'll need a sufficiently charged battery. So if the camera loses power halfway through the process, or if it is interrupted, you have a chance to cause the camera to lose all of its software, which means it can't do a startup, which means you'll have to take it into a service center and let them tell you what to do. We'll need a card reader this morning as well. We'll need the actual firmware update file, and specifically, you'll be looking for the latest version of the firmware that is available from most manufacturers. And then you also need a camera that actually needs updating. So at the moment, we're running on the Canon EOS R, and it's running firmware 1.4.0. And late last year, there was an update to 1.6.0. So we'll be doing the update that way today. Is there any questions? I know I'm blasting through this quite quickly. Is there any questions or anything like that you guys had, or if you had any concerns? Well, good go. All right, great. So just gonna see if I can screen share here. Beautiful, okay. So what we'll need to do is we'll need to run and grab the firmware file. That will be the most, I guess, the first thing to think about. So if I just grab in here. So we'll just go to Canon's website first. Ah, beautiful. Right, so how to find out if your camera needs updating. So the easiest way to find out is first check the latest firmware from Canon's website. So in this instance, it'll be from Canon. The next thing you'll need to know is to find out the firmware of your camera itself. So you can do that through the menus, and we'll be going through that in just a moment when we actually go through the firmware, but it will show the exact firmware update that is applied to your camera when you go into the menu system. Yeah, so usually it's in the setup menu, so the yellow spanner menu for Canon cameras. But yeah, we'll go through that in just a moment. Yeah, so the best place to find it will be from Canon's website itself. Third-party websites may hold those firmware updates, but it's best just to get them directly from Canon. It's the safest option, and most cameras that ever needed a firmware update, things like the 5D Mark II, 5D Mark III, 6D, most of those firmware updates are still available from the Canon servers. So no need to really look elsewhere. For Canon cameras older than that, there's not really too much point to updating those firmware or checking. I mean, you can check, but usually there hasn't been, these are 10-year-old cameras plus, there usually hasn't been any updates since then. And there are a lot of them are using the EF glass, which hasn't really changed as a standard since then as well. Yes, wonderful. So we're right here with the Canon website. So what we'll want to do is first run into support and support drivers and downloads. That's the first section there. This is the Canon AU website, by the way. So on Canon support, you'll want to scroll down and select the drivers and downloads on the left-hand side there. Beautiful. And we'll want to jump into cameras. Now, there are firmware updates available for lenses. However, they're very rare. They only usually occur when there's bug fixes or anything like that. And most Canon lenses never really get those. So you can definitely check the firmware of your lens that is mounted to your camera when you do check the firmware later on in body. Yeah, so Jake, if you just scroll up and just search for the EOS R in the search menu. Yeah, so just EOS and R. Perfect. So that's our camera at the moment, but of course you'd put in your camera if you, whichever one you were looking at firmware updating. So this is the support page. It'll look very similar for most cameras. And you'll want to scroll right down to the bottom, which will show you the firmware update. So you can see there, it's 1.6, and that was released in 2019. What a year, right, guys? Anyway, so we want to download that one and just drag and drop it straight into your file. Now, this page here shows the previous patch notes for the camera. So every iteration of firmware has a few patch notes, and just as an idea of what things would have changed. So the 1.6, I believe, adds firmware updating or compatibility for the 85mm lens, and just a few bug fixes as well. So what we'll do is we'll download the file and just put it into a freshly formatted card. There we go. So we'll download the file first. So I believe we already have the file on this, but we'll just show you the process anyway. Right, there it is. So it is a zip file. I believe this one is for Windows computers, but it should work either way. If you have a Mac computer, there should be an option there to select for a Mac. So the FIR file is the one that you're looking for. The other file is just a bunch of PDFs that runs the process. As you can see, Jake's now pulling the arm. So there it is. It's already on our card, but you would just drag and drop right into the card. So you want to put it in the main directory, not in any subfolders or anything like that, just so the camera can see it easily. Beautiful. All right. So we'll run back to me. There we go again. So we'll just check it, our card back into our camera, and we shall. Ooh. Oh, just lost the signal there. That's all right. The car door is open, that's why. There we are. We're back. So once the file's in there on the freshly formatted card, we'll just run into the menu system now. So from here is where you would see the firmware settings. So you'll want to jump over here. Right, so you can see here, it should be on page 6. However, it's not showing up because we are in movie mode. So we want to chuck it into program mode first. Once we put it into program, we should be able to see it. So your camera, most likely, if it's not the EOS R, will have a physical dial for this. So best to just put in program. So if you have it in Intelligent Auto, the green one, it may not show this as an option on your menu. So just keep that in mind, that certain menus are affected by the mode that the camera is in. So now we're in program, it should be in page 6. There it is. So our firmware running is version 1.4.0, and we're updating to 1.6.0 today. So all we'll need to do is press the set button to select that firmware option. Right, so Erica, how does it get onto the card when downloading? So what you'll have to do is you'll have to download the file onto your computer, and then you'll have to manually transfer that file from your computer onto the card. So you'll need the card reader in this case, and the freshly minted card, of course. Does that sort of clear it up for you?
We'll check in a second.
Yeah, if you need a further clarification, just let me know. Yeah, no problem. It doesn't automatically go on. It's not quite as streamlined as that. Everyone's computer is going to be different, of course. So yeah, the basic process would just be to take the file and put it onto your card manually, just like you're taking photos off your card, except kind of the reverse process. Great, so the camera here is listed as 1.4.0, and we know we have one of 1.6.0 file on there. So you'll select set, and then you've got to cancel or OK. So we charged our battery earlier this morning. So something to be checking here is making sure your battery is above 50%. I'd say use a freshly charged battery just to be sure. Yeah, so one of your, like maybe your newest battery even, just to be double sure, because if we lose power throughout this process, you'll see there's a warning about that as we go through. So we'll just hit set to go OK. Right, and the camera is now updating. You can't see me because the camera is off, but it can no longer do a live stream or a stream of the through the HDMI output while the camera is updating. It's effectively, we're rearranging the brains of the camera at this point, so it has to do the whole thing, and the processor no longer is able to be away. Yes, so most firmware is capable of crossing versions. The only available option to download, for example, is the 1.6. So you will be able to jump straight in from 1.3 to 1.6. You should also be able to jump from 1 to 1.6 as well. Yeah, sorry, I'll just clarify. The question there was if the camera is at 1.3, would it be able to go straight to 1.6? And yes, you should be able to go straight to 1.6. The only available option to download is 1.6, so there's no way to download 1.4 first. That goes as well if you have any other version camera, say the 5D Mark IV or the 5D Mark III. If there have been a few firmware updates in between your camera being released and today, you should just be able to update to the latest version. Great, so I guess while we're in the downtime, as I mentioned earlier, we'll be running a set of firmware updates in the next couple of days, and then a couple next week on the Tuesday. This will run through most of the range of cameras that we have downstairs. So a great question by John at the moment, but I'll just keep running through the webinars, and then I'll get back to your question, John. Yeah, so we're running a set of webinars for firmware updating. These are all free, and you're welcome to join in on any one of the cameras that you might have. Most of you guys probably have Canon cameras. I assume that you're here for Canon. But if you have any other cameras as well, we can run through those. The process can be quite different for each individual camera brand. So good to know how to do it on everyone. Well, not everyone. Good for me to know, but good the ones that you have. So from then on, we'll be running some webinars on photographic topics, things like Lightroom, macro, portraiture, these sort of broad but mildly specific topics that you guys, if you're interested in knowing more about, you're welcome to sign up to those as well. Those will be in the coming weeks, and at the moment our scheduling is 1 per week, so I'll give us plenty of time to prepare, but also plenty of you guys to learn and pick up those skills and then practice them over the week. So I'll come back to John's question. So it looks like the only advantage for his 6D Mark I, great camera by the way, my old first full frame camera, is correct default the lens he doesn't use. So yes, while it's best to keep on the latest firmware for a lot of the modern cameras, which will have bug fixes, AF improvements, things like that, for the 6D Mark I, if you haven't seen any, in essence, the camera itself is quite old. Well, not old, but it's released a few years ago now. And they won't be doing any sort of active updating on that camera. So if they run into any major bugs or any major faults, they'll do an update. But if it's on a lens that you're not really using, performance-wise, you won't see a difference between your current version and your new one. So no, it's not necessarily pertinent to do the upgrade, provided that there is a risk of the camera no longer functioning after if you do lose power. So if you don't want to take the risk in that sense, that's no problem. And if you do functionally use that lens in the future, yeah, perhaps maybe look into doing it. But again, it's not something you absolutely have to do. But for the newer cameras, it's highly recommended. Okay, so Rosa has a question here. So if the camera's working fine, no problems, no new lenses, do I really need to update the firmware? So depending on what camera you have, yes and no. So if your camera is a bit older, say a DSLR style camera that has been around for many years, like John's 6D, so 5DSR, right? So the 5DSR, if I remember correctly, didn't have too many issues when it came out. So, I mean, if it's working fine for you now, that you should look at the firmware updates just to make sure there isn't anything that they have fixed in the meantime. But you might have a camera, you sort of have a normal expected performance of the camera, but then a firmware update comes along and then it adds features or improves it. So specifically for the EOS R and Canon cameras, I assume going forward, we'll be seeing a lot of those updates come through and add functionality. For example, the eye tracking firmware update came in, I think early last year. And so, yeah, so that added a bunch of functionality that you might not have seen either way. So just seeing here that the EOS R camera has now updated. Oh, beautiful. There you go. Right, so you can see all my settings too. So now I'm back on. Yeah. So the firmware is now updated to a version 1.6. Jake, did you want to just jump in and just check the firmware had actually been updated? So it should say 1.6 now, as opposed to 1.4. He'll have to jump back into program mode. Okay, great. That's no problem. We'll have to power it off for a moment and then just run it that way. But anyway, I'll come back to the questions. So I got a question here from Jude asking how often do updates come along and are we notified? So we aren't notified specifically, and I don't believe there is a way to get automatic notifications from Canon. But it depends really on the age of the camera. So yeah, as you can see here, just jump back in, the firmware is now 1.6.0, so it was successful, which is excellent. So if we ever do use that 85mm RF lens, we'll be good to go. Anyway, so yeah, so Jude, your question, how long does it come along? So for the EOS R, particularly in early in its life cycle, it was coming along. There were quite a few updates, updates to sensor performance, updates to noise reduction. Like I mentioned earlier, the AF performance and features, they were also updated fairly early on in its life cycle as well. And usually when we see new RF lenses come out, you'll see an update roughly around then. It's really down to the software developers and writers, I suppose, in Canon, and also whether there is a necessity to do the update. If there is a major fault or a bug, or if a firmware update introduces any of these things, or even a software vulnerability for wireless transmission, for example, then yes, there'll be a firmware update for it. But as it turns to a roadmap or a sort of timeline for firmware updates, it's the sort of guess and go. But most major firmware updates that add functionality will be covered by wherever you get your camera news. So I think we should probably put that in some of our news, actually. So if you guys wanted to know if there's any major updates for features on new cameras, something that we can look into doing if you guys are interested. Yeah, wherever you get your camera news, you know, for the blogs, YouTube, for example, for major firmware updates, they'll mention it. So Z6 had a firmware update a few months ago that added some AF tracking functionality. That was covered quite heavily in the news. Anytime Sony does an update for added functionality, say animal eye tracking, that'll be covered. When Canon first released the EOS R and then their subsequent sensor and noise reduction firmware update, that was heavily covered as well. So no automated way to get it, unfortunately, from Canon. Yeah, wherever you get your news, you should be able to keep on. Oh, beautiful. Good to hear, Kat. Love to help you guys out. And yeah, really, you know, not a very step-heavy process, just some things to think about. And once updated, you can rest easy that your camera is getting the best performance that Canon can provide. Yeah, no problem. So how likely is an update required for the 5DSR, asks Philip. At the moment, I don't believe Canon is, I mean, I'm not too privy about their internal policy or internal company structure, but I don't believe that they are actively working on firmware updates for the 5DSR. I think if they were to release more EF glass, however likely or unlikely that is, we may see an update if there is a compatibility issue with the new EF glass. But at the moment, the 5DSR is sufficiently old enough that I believe the camera or the product is finished or completed. So they would have taken development teams off that. If there is a software vulnerability or if there's a major fault or big bugs that are coming up, they may address those in a firmware update. But I think at the moment, most of the R&D team and specifically the software team is hard at work developing new software for the R5 and any updates for the RP and the R. So I couldn't imagine there would be too many for the 5DSR going forward. Great question though, and something to think about. Just check check now, and if you don't see an update, your camera's always been at peak performance, which is really, really good. Great. So Louise asks, how would you check the firmware updated when the firmware update is? Yeah. So as we mentioned earlier, once the firmware is done, if you jump back into your menu system there and then check where you updated the firmware, it should then list the current firmware on the camera. So we're now at 1.6.0. Yeah, so that's how you would check. And it's good to check, just double check afterwards as well to make sure everything has gone through smoothly. Yeah, no problem, guys. I'm really happy to answer the question. Really happy to answer the questions. So yeah, once the firmware update is complete on our camera, we're just sort of cruising along. So next 30 minutes I've got here for questions. So yeah, if you guys wanted any sort of one-on-one help or anything like that, or if you guys had any questions further to to operating systems that you might not think about today, then feel free to jump in to our website and you'll be able to start a video call with one of our friendly team. I think in the current environment, if you are in Brisbane, it's possible to come into the showroom, but it's best to stay at home as the advice given by the government. So feel free to jump in on our video calls. We'll be able to help you out. We've got the full range of current Canon cameras down in the showroom and a bunch of lenses too. So if you wanted to run through anything that way, if you have any questions or anything like that that pops into your mind in the shower or whatever, then yeah, just come on to our web chat and we'll be able to help you out. Right. So yes, you can just reformat the card to remove the update. It's the same process as if you were to remove anything off that card. The updates tend to be quite small. It's not going to really affect the performance of the card anyway. Leaving it on there, it's not this way, not that way, but yeah, just reformat afterwards to get rid of it. It's the best way to go. Also a question asked by Kat. Now another question from Louise. I'll go in chronological order. If you're not confident to update firmware, what can I do? So you can pop into our showroom if you're in Brisbane, and we'll be able to run through the firmware update with you there. We mostly have all the gear required, as well as all the cards necessary to do that sort of thing. So you can pop in and we can do it physically. Another way you could do it, I believe, is Canon run a firmware updating service. So you can send your Canon camera to them. It is a bit of a process though. You'll have to contact support, set up a ticket, that sort of thing. So if you're not in Brisbane, you should be able to go to, you should be able to contact Canon that way. Yeah, you may also be able to give us a call over video and we can run through it that way as well. Just so we can run through the process. We have most of the cameras that are active lines down in the showroom, so we can run through it that way. If you have an older camera, the good thing about Canon is that their menu system hasn't changed in, I think, maybe almost 10 years now. So very easy to run through that with you there. Thanks, Louise. Great. Any other questions? What's my favorite website to check latest updates? So me personally, thank you, Jax. That's a good question. Me personally, I use a variety of sources to get news photography-wise. A lot of the photography YouTubers do quite prompt updates on things. It is a bit of a time sink, so I like to take my time with it and watch those. But also I use a website Petapixel that usually has some interesting articles on that one there. That's my own personal preference. Of course, I don't endorse any of these on behalf of CameraPro, but something that I personally use is I use Petapixel. But yeah, I think most of my information comes from YouTube. Funnily enough, I heard about some some new camera releases through Instagram. So I guess that's one of my sources as well. Sometimes you get a gem and it just comes through. And yeah, I was right on the button for that one. So yeah, great question. Thanks, John. Jackson, sorry. Right, so Louise, another question here. Will any type or size of memory card work for downloading? Yes, so most firmware updates are very small, unless you have a card from the 90s. You'll have a card large enough for it. Anything usually works fine. It doesn't really matter about the speed of the card as well, because again, the firmware update is very, very small. The your camera will offload that file straight away. And then just store it in the camera while it's doing its update. So again, best leave the card in there while it's going, but yeah, any card, any size, as long as it fits in your camera and it's compatible and you can store files to it, then it should be working. Don't use any cards that have had a corruption in the past. Just to be completely clear, any of those cards that may have had faults or issues with their internal structure, or maybe they may be getting to their lifespan, or they've had many writes and reads, and then have had evidence of them corrupting in the past. Best just to use a newer card if that's possible, just to be sure that you don't have any corruption or read-write errors with the card and camera. Because again, if the camera is updating its process and is interrupted for whatever reason, it can cause the camera to no longer able to post up and boot, which is not good at all. So best to make sure your card's working. Should leave lens on camera when updating. Doesn't really matter. Functionally, you'll be able to see the firmware on the lens if you do leave a lens on there, but if you feel more comfortable leaving it off, that's fine too. Not a big deal, I think. Either or, really, just a preference. It doesn't really matter if the lens is on or not, but yeah, great question, actually. Didn't really think about that. Will I have to have a fully charged battery? Yeah, so best practice is to have a fully charged battery, one that is of good battery performance. And that's something that you can check in camera as well. There should be a battery setting, and you should be able to check the performance of your battery that way. So I'd say getting a battery with good performance and that is highly charged will be the best practice to do that one as well. I don't believe Canon does, but some brands will prevent you from doing a firmware update if the battery is below 50%. But Canon, I don't believe, offers such a protection. So best just to use a fully charged battery just to be sure. Great question. Right, so Louise, another question here. Where do I just put the firmware file? So just put it in the main directory, not in any subfolders or anything like that, just the main directory so the camera can see it. If you go do the firmware update and the camera can't see the file, it will not let you proceed. So one of the major causes for this is that it's in a subfolder of some sort. So just in the main directory, not in any subfolder, should be right there. Yeah, thanks for the question, guys. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so any other questions you guys have? I mean, we can extend this slightly further to firmware if you guys like. But I'll do my best to answer them whenever they come up. Yeah, really appreciate you guys joining us. If there are any latecomers that would like a further update to the process, I can go through it again quickly if you like. But our camera is actually updated now already, so there's not really much I can do. Awesome. Well, good luck, Lynn. I hope it goes well for you. Oh, beautiful. Yeah. Yeah. No worries at all, Jude. We're happy to help. And any way to get better performance out of your camera is really good. All right. Well, I'll just leave it for a couple more minutes, and any other questions we'll run through. And other than that, we'll wrap it up, guys. Thanks for joining us, and we really hope that you learned something today. If not, we're happy for you to join us anyway. As I mentioned earlier, we are running these webinars in the next couple of days, next week, and then after that on a weekly basis. So we'll be covering a range of topics, from portraiture to macro photography, things that I think at the moment the idea is things that you could do at home. So we'll be running basic Lightroom one as well. So just sort of really basics, get you into that. Maybe give you some ideas, something to try out, which would be really nice. But for tomorrow and next week, we'll be running some more firmware update ones. So you can keep your eye out on our Eventbrite page, and that should list all the current webinars and future webinars. Yeah, I think it's time for a coffee for me too, John. Cheers. Thanks for joining us, guys. And we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining in, and have a great day, guys.